She woke up to the sound of birds outside her window. For a moment, the world felt normal. The sunlight came softly through the curtains, painting the walls of her small room with golden streaks. She rubbed her eyes and stretched, feeling the familiar creak of the old wooden floor under her feet. The piano sat in the corner, its black and white keys gleaming softly in the morning light. She had loved this piano ever since she could remember. Every note, every melody, every sound felt like a friend she could always turn to. No matter what, her mother called from the kitchen, reminding her to eat breakfast. The smell of warm bread and tea floated into her room. Her father was already at work, and her older brother had left early to help a neighbor with some repairs. Life had always been simple in this city, filled with ordinary joys: school, friends, laughter, music. But lately, the city had started to feel different. There was a tension in the air, quiet unease that people whispered about, but rarely spoke of aloud. She sat at the piano and pressed, her fingers gently on the keys. A soft note filled the room, and she smiled. Music made her feel safe. She practiced the same piece she had been learning for weeks, her small hands moving across the keys with care. Her mother peeked in and watched her for a moment, her eyes full of pride. "You have a gift," she said quietly. The girl only smiled, too focused on the music to respond. Outside, the city was alive in its usual way. Children ran to school, merchants opened their shops, and the sounds of everyday life filled the streets. But she noticed the cracks in the walls of buildings that had once seemed solid. Some streets were quieter than before. Sometimes, in the distance, she could hear a faint rumble, a sound that didn't belong to the city's normal rhythm. It was subtle at first, almost easy to ignore, but over time it grew louder, like a shadow stretching over her world. Her best friend came running to her house, waving from the street. "Come on, we're going to be late," she shouted with a laugh. The girl closed the piano gently and ran to join her. They laughed and talked as they walked through the city streets, passing familiar shops and fountains. People smiled and nodded at them, but there was a tension beneath the smiles. Everyone seemed to be holding something inside, something heavy. At school, the teachers tried to keep things normal. Lessons went on, and children still learned and played. But there were moments when the lessons were interrupted by distant sounds that made everyone pause. The girl sometimes felt her heart skip a beat when she heard these noises, unsure if it was a truck or something else. Her classmates whispered about it, sharing rumors and stories. But no one really understood what was happening. She found comfort in the music room at school. The piano there was old and a little worn, but it had a voice that made her feel calm. During breaks, she would sit there and play quietly, letting her fingers move across the keys while the world outside seemed to hold its breath. Sometimes the other children would peek in and listen, drawn to the melodies she created. They didn't always say anything, but she could see their eyes soften, their tense shoulders relax. Music had a way of making people feel safe, even when everything else felt uncertain. One evening, she walked home with her mother. The streets were quieter than usual. Shops were closing early, and some windows were shuttered. People moved quickly, heads down, as if trying to avoid something unseen. Her mother held her hand tightly, her face pale and serious. "We have to be careful," she said softly. The girl nodded, sensing the worry in her mother's voice. She didn't fully understand, but she felt the weight of it pressing down on her young shoulders. At home, they gathered around the small dinner table. Her father came in late, tired and quiet. He didn't speak much, only asking how her day had been. The girl tried to describe the music she had played, the notes and melodies that had filled the music room at school. Her father smiled faintly, but his eyes were heavy. There were talks on the radio, and sometimes the television showed images she didn't fully understand. People were moving, buildings were emptying, and there were stories of families leaving the city. She tried not to think about it. Night fell, and the girl lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The city outside was quiet, but the unease lingered. She imagined the music room at school, the piano waiting for her hands to bring it to life. She imagined the notes flowing like water, like a river that could wash away the fear. Sleep came slowly, and her dreams were filled with music and shadows, strange mixture that left her heart racing. The next morning, the city felt even different. More shops were closed. More streets were empty. People moved quickly, their faces tense. She walked to school with her friend, holding hands tightly. Her friend whispered, "Do you think we'll have a normal day?" The girl didn't answer. She only looked around, trying to see the familiar, trying to find comfort in the small details, the birds on the rooftops, the flowers in the window boxes, the warm sunlight on the pavement at school. Lessons continued, but the teachers spoke less. The children played quietly, careful not to make too much noise. During the break, the girl went to the music room and played the piano. This time, she tried a new piece, one she had been learning in secret. The notes were soft, hesitant at first, but as she continued, they grew stronger. Other children came in quietly, listening. They didn't speak. They only sat and watched, letting the music fill the space between them. The piano became a refuge, a place where the world outside could not reach. She felt herself becoming more connected to it, more reliant on it for comfort. Every day she found herself drawn to the keys, unable to resist the pull of the melodies. She played when she was happy, when she was scared, when she was tired. Each note carried her emotions. Each chord was a story she could not tell in words. Her family noticed the change. Her mother often watched her play, a mix of pride and worry in her eyes. Her father sometimes paused in the doorway, listening silently. They understood that music was her way of coping, her way of keeping a part of normal life alive in a world that was slowly being taken away from them. One afternoon, she walked through the city streets with her mother. They saw families packing their belongings, leaving in a hurry. She saw neighbors she had known all her life carrying children in bags, moving quickly to escape something she did not yet understand. Her heart ached at the thought of leaving her home, her school, her piano. She clutched her mother's hand tightly, afraid of what might come next. Back home, she sat at her piano and played late into the evening. The notes filled the room, echoing softly against the walls. Her mother sat nearby, sewing quietly, and her father read the newspaper. The girl felt a strange mix of fear and hope. The world outside was changing, growing darker. But here in this room, music was still alive. She closed her eyes and let the melodies carry her, imagining a world where laughter and sunlight still existed. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the city grew. Sirens became more frequent, and distant noises made everyone pause. She heard stories from neighbors about families leaving, about buildings damaged, about lives changed in an instant. Yet, she kept playing. Each day, she returned to the piano, finding comfort in the familiar keys. She practiced the same pieces, learned new ones, and even started to compose small melodies of her own. Music became her language, a way to speak when words were not enough. Even her friends noticed. They would gather quietly outside her house, listening to the soft notes drifting from her window. The girl didn't speak much to them, but she didn't need to. The music said everything. It spoke of fear and hope, sadness and strength, loss and resilience. It reminded them all that even in a city slowly losing its normalcy, there was still something beautiful, something human, something that could not be taken away. One morning, as she walked to school, she noticed a group of children staring at a building across the street. The windows were dark, the doors closed, and the street was empty. She realized that parts of the city she had known all her life were disappearing one by one. She felt a pang of fear, but also a strange determination. If the city was changing, if the world outside was becoming unsafe, then the music had to remain. She had to keep playing, keep creating, keep holding on to the normal life that was slipping away at school. The teachers encouraged her quietly, letting her play in the music room whenever she needed. They understood that music was not just a hobby for her, it was a lifeline. The girl felt a sense of responsibility. She was young, but she knew that her playing could bring a moment of peace to others, even if only for a few minutes. She imagined the city listening, imagined the children pausing their worries, imagined families feeling a small sense of calm. As evening fell, she returned home, her hands tired but her spirit steady. She played the piano for her family, letting the notes fill the small apartment. Her mother smiled softly, her father nodded in quiet approval, and her brother listened, eyes wide with wonder. The girl realized that in these moments she was not just playing for herself, she was playing for everyone around her. The music became a shield, a small act of defiance against the fear that was slowly creeping into their lives. Night came, and she lay in bed, listening to the city outside. The sounds were different now, quieter, more distant, yet filled with a tension she could not ignore. But she held on to the piano, held on to the music, held on to the small pieces of normal life that remained. She knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, and new changes. But as long as she had the music, she felt a quiet strength, a hope that even in the darkest times, there was a light she could create with her own hands. The girl closed her eyes and let the melodies she had played throughout the day drift through her mind. The piano was more than an instrument. It was a friend, a companion, a guardian of the life she loved. She promised herself that no matter what happened, she would continue to play. She would continue to fill the silence with music, even if the world outside had forgotten what normal life felt like. And so, in the quiet of her room, in the gentle glow of the evening light, she dreamed. She dreamed of melodies that could heal, of music that could comfort, of a city that could remember laughter and sunlight once more. She was young, but she understood something important. Already music could survive when everything else seemed lost. And in her heart, she knew that as long as she played, there was hope. The city that had once felt familiar and safe began to change. The morning sun still rose in the sky, but it no longer brought comfort. Instead, it seemed to illuminate the cracks and scars that were appearing everywhere. The streets that had been filled with laughter and chatter were now quieter. Shops that had once opened their doors with friendly greetings were boarded up, their windows dark and empty. People moved quickly, heads down, eyes wary, whispering to each other in urgent tones. Even the girl could feel the tension pressing on her chest, though she did not fully understand why. It started with the sounds. At first, they were distant, almost like echoes from another world. She would hear low rumbles in the distance, far enough that they did not seem to pose a threat, but close enough to make her pause in the middle of her walk to school. Teachers tried to keep lessons normal, but there were moments when they would stop mid-sentence, listening to something that no one could explain. Children whispered to each other, sharing fears they barely understood. Even her friends, normally full of energy, seemed quieter, their laughter smaller, their eyes more serious. One day while walking to school, she saw a man carrying a heavy bag across the street. His face was pale and his eyes darted nervously. Children stepped aside, watching him pass, sensing something in his expression that made them uneasy. She looked around and noticed other people moving quickly, packing bags, closing windows, locking doors. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath. Her mother held her hand tighter than usual that day, whispering, "Stay close to me." She obeyed without question, feeling a mixture of fear and trust in her mother's grasp. At home, the atmosphere was different. The once cheerful apartment felt smaller, heavier. Her father stayed quiet more often, reading newspapers or listening to the radio, his brow furrowed with worry. Her mother tried to keep some sense of normalcy, cooking meals and keeping the apartment clean, but the unease was always there, just beneath the surface. The girl would sit at the piano and play quietly, letting the notes carry her fears away for a short while. The piano was still her refuge, the one place where she felt safe in a world that was becoming unpredictable. One afternoon, a distant explosion shook the city. The ground trembled slightly under her feet, and a low rumble followed, echoing through the streets. Windows rattled, and people ran toward the nearest shelters or safer buildings. Her mother grabbed her hand, pulling her down a narrow alley, away from the open street. The girl clutched her small backpack tightly, her heart racing, her ears filled with the sounds of fear. She had never heard anything like it before. The rumble faded, leaving silence that was heavier than the noise itself. When they returned home, the city seemed different. The streets were emptier, the air thicker, with smoke from distant fires. News reports mentioned damaged buildings, families fleeing, and neighborhoods destroyed. Her father spoke quietly to her mother, discussing plans for safety, places to go if the danger came closer. She listened from the other room, trying to understand, but the words were confusing. All she knew was that the world outside was no longer the one she had known. It was a place where safety was fragile, where fear could arrive without warning, where life could change in an instant. At school, lessons became harder to follow. Teachers tried to keep routines, but children's minds wandered, filled with worries they could not express. During breaks, she would sneak into the music room, pressing her fingers on the piano keys. The notes were shaky at first, reflecting her unease, but as she continued, the music grew stronger, steadier. Other children began to join her, some just listening, some tentatively playing. In those moments, the room became a shelter, a small world untouched by the chaos outside. The girl realized that music could create a sense of calm, even if only for a few minutes. One evening, her family gathered in the living room, the radio reporting new developments in the city. Her father spoke softly, explaining that parts of the city were unsafe and that neighbors were leaving. He mentioned that they might have to leave their home if things got worse. The girl felt a wave of fear wash over her. The thought of leaving her piano, her school, and her friends was unbearable. Her mother squeezed her hand, understanding the unspoken worry in her daughter's eyes. "We will do what is safest," she said, trying to reassure her, though her own voice trembled slightly. Nighttime brought little comfort. The distant sounds of explosions or gunfire sometimes reached their apartment, even if faint. She would lie in bed, listening carefully, trying to identify the noises. Sometimes she would imagine that it was just construction or trucks, anything to make the fear manageable. Other times, the noises were unmistakable, and she would clutch her pillow tightly, wishing for the music in her mind to protect her. The piano had always been a friend, but now it felt like a shield she could not touch. While away from home, days blurred into one another. The city continued to change, buildings damaged or abandoned, streets emptier, people moving with hurried steps. Her father spent long hours trying to gather information, planning routes and safety measures, while her mother focused on keeping the household functioning despite the fear. The girls' school offered lessons as best as it could, but many students stayed home out of worry. Those who attended were quieter, more cautious. The girl spent much of her time in the music room, her fingers flying over the keys, letting her emotions pour out in melodies. Her friend came less often now. Parents were worried about leaving the house, and the streets were no longer safe for children to roam freely. When they met, it was always briefly in quiet corners or inside homes. They would talk in whispers, sharing news they had overheard, or fears they barely understood. Sometimes they played small games, but even laughter felt subdued, carrying a note of caution. The girl longed for the days when they could run freely through the streets, their voices blending with the city's everyday sounds. One morning, as she walked to school with her mother, they saw families carrying whatever belongings they could manage. Children clutched small bags, mothers held hands tightly, fathers carried heavy bundles on their backs. The sight was unsettling. She realized that people were leaving not for vacations or work, but because they had no choice. The city she had known for her entire life was vanishing in pieces, replaced by fear, uncertainty, and loss. She tightened her mother's hand in her own, feeling the strength it gave her. At school, the music room became more important than ever. It was a space untouched by the growing chaos outside. She would play for hours, experimenting with notes, creating small melodies she had never tried before. Sometimes other students would sneak in, listening quietly, finding a moment of peace among the keys and strings. The girl began to understand that music could be more than a personal refuge, could be a way to help others feel safe. Even if only for a short while, her parents noticed her growing dedication to the piano. They tried to encourage her without adding pressure, understanding that music was now more than just a hobby. Her father would sometimes listen quietly, nodding in approval, while her mother would smile softly. Eyes full of both pride and concern, they knew the world outside was dangerous. But inside their small apartment, the girl's music brought light, hope, and a reminder of normalcy. One afternoon, as they returned from a short trip to buy supplies, they saw a building that had collapsed not far from their street. Dust and debris filled the air. The girl could barely comprehend what she was seeing. People whispered about the families who had lived there, about neighbors who might be trapped. Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering, "We are lucky to be safe for now." The girl nodded silently, her mind racing with thoughts she could not put into words. Music would have to wait. For now, survival came first. The nights grew harder. Explosions came closer, sirens more frequent. Sometimes the family would huddle together in the hallway, listening to the sounds outside, praying for safety. The girl missed her friends, her school, the ordinary life that had been taken from them. Yet she held onto the piano, imagining the melodies she would play when the world was quiet again. It was her anchor, her reminder that beauty and hope could survive even in the darkest times. School eventually closed. The city was too dangerous, and most families stayed inside their homes. The girl felt isolated, but she continued to practice on her small piano at home. She would compose new pieces, creating melodies that reflected the emotions she could not express with words. Sometimes her mother or father would listen, offering quiet encouragement. The piano had become more than music. It was a way to survive, a way to hold on to humanity when the world seemed determined to take it away. One day, a distant explosion shook the building slightly. She clutched the piano for a moment, feeling the vibration travel through the floor. The noise faded, leaving only silence. She realized that fear had become a constant companion, one she could not escape. Yet she also understood that the music she created could push back against that fear, even if only for a moment. Each note was a small act of courage, a refusal to let the chaos outside take everything. Weeks passed, and the city continued to change. Families left, streets emptied, and buildings showed the marks of destruction. Yet, in the girl's apartment, music continued to exist. Her piano remained a faithful companion, and she played every day, letting the melodies carry her through the fear. Sometimes her friends would hear her music from nearby buildings, drawn to the sound like moths to a flame. In those moments, the music connected them all, creating a small community of hope in a city otherwise filled with despair. Through it all, the girl learned something important. Fear could not be ignored, and danger was real, but beauty, hope, and courage could exist even in the most unlikely places. Music was her way to resist, her way to survive, her way to remind herself and others that humanity still mattered. Even in a world slowly being consumed by war, the girl understood that she could create a space of peace, a place where hearts could find comfort, and a moment where the world could pause. Even if just for a few minutes, the city was no longer a place of laughter or routine. The streets were cracked and empty, buildings stood half destroyed, and dust floated through the air like a permanent fog. Life had become a careful step from one moment to the next, and the girl's world had shrunk to the size of her small apartment and the immediate streets around it. Every day, she would peek out the window, watching the deserted avenues, hoping to see a familiar face or a flicker of normal life. But mostly, she saw silence, punctuated by distant rumbles and the occasional flash of fire in the distance. Despite the danger, the piano remained her sanctuary. It sat in the corner of the living room, its black and white keys still shining despite the dust that sometimes settled around it. Each day, she would sit at it, her fingers moving slowly at first, then faster, letting the music take over. She played softly at first, careful not to attract attention. But as the days passed, the fear inside her began to merge with her determination. She realized that music could be more than comfort, it could be courage. It could be a voice when words failed. One afternoon, she stepped outside with her mother to check the street for supplies. They moved cautiously, avoiding rubble and broken glass, keeping low when necessary. The city around them was eerily quiet. Occasionally, they would hear footsteps, the creak of a door, or the distant hum of engines. The girl's heart would race each time, but she tried to remain calm. She knew that fear was natural, but she also understood that panic could be dangerous. Her mother held her hand tightly, guiding her carefully as they moved, as they returned home. The girl noticed a small group gathered in the street near a partially destroyed building. She could see adults whispering to each other, pointing at something she could not immediately see. Curious and cautious, she edged closer, her mother keeping a watchful eye. In the center of the small crowd, she saw an old piano, damaged but mostly intact. Sitting on the pavement, as if placed there for her. Its surface was scratched and dusty, keys chipped in places, but it was still a piano. Her heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she just stared. It seemed impossible that in the middle of destruction, amidst rubble and fear, a piano could survive. Something inside her whispered that this was not a coincidence. The crowd around it whispered among themselves, hesitant, unsure, but drawn to the strange sight. Without thinking, she walked closer. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. The notes that followed were soft, almost hesitant, but they were music. It's alive in a place where it had been absent for so long. People around her paused. Some held their children closer. Some stopped mid-step. The sound of the piano, fragile but persistent, cut through the silence of the street. Slowly, the girl became more confident. She played longer, her hands moving with purpose now. The melody carried through the empty streets, brushing against the broken buildings and the frightened faces of the onlookers. A soldier passing by slowed his steps, listening. A woman carrying a basket of food set it down, transfixed. Even those who had been too busy worrying to notice. Anything now stopped and turned toward the music. The girl did not play for an audience. She played because the music had become a part of her. Because it was the only way she knew to respond to the fear surrounding her. But as the notes filled the air, she realized that the crowd had grown. More people had emerged from alleys, from doorways, from broken stairwells. They stood silently, listening, some with tears in their eyes, others with mouths slightly open, as if afraid to breathe too loudly and break the spell. She felt the weight of their attention but did not falter. The music gave her strength, and with each note she became bolder. Time seemed to slow. The sounds of war, explosions, and chaos were distant now, muted by the power of the piano. People forgot their fear for a few moments. Children stopped crying. Soldiers stopped marching. Neighbors forgot the hunger and exhaustion pressing on them. All that remained was the music and the girl who played it. Small but unwavering, creating a bubble of calm in the middle of destruction. She noticed an older man, his face lined with worry and grief, smiling softly as he listened. A young mother held her child close, swaying slightly to the melody. Even the stray animals that roamed the streets seemed to pause, ears twitching at the sound. Somewhere in the crowd, someone had a small camera capturing the scene without her noticing. They filmed quietly, not wanting to interrupt, recording the fragile magic of a young girl playing music in the ruins. She continued for what felt like hours, though she was not sure if it was a few minutes or much longer. Each note carried more than sound, it carried hope, a sense of normalcy, a reminder that humanity could exist even in the darkest times. When she finally stopped, the silence was almost overwhelming. People remained still, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace the music had created. Then, slowly, someone clapped. Another followed. Then more hands joined, tentative at first, then stronger. The applause was not loud, but it was enough. The girl felt a warmth she had not felt in weeks. She smiled, though her hands were sore and her back ached from standing. For the first time in a long while, she felt that she had done something meaningful, something that could reach beyond fear and destruction. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some returning to their homes, others lingering to speak quietly with neighbors. But the memory of the music lingered, like an echo that would not fade. The girl returned to her apartment with her mother, her heart still racing. She could not stop thinking about the piano on the street, about the people who had stopped to listen, about the magic of those few minutes where the world seemed to pause. She played again that evening at home softly, letting the music wash over her and her family. The following days were filled with cautious hope. Word of her playing spread quietly through the city. People who had heard the music spoke of it to friends and neighbors, describing the small girl who had brought a moment of peace to a street otherwise filled with fear. Some even said they felt courage return, a small spark that had been missing for weeks. The girl did not understand fully what this meant, but she felt a sense of responsibility. The music was no longer just for herself, it had become a gift she could share. A light in a place where shadows had been growing. Her parents noticed the change in her as well. She seemed more determined, more confident, as if the music had unlocked something within her. She still feared the world outside, still worried about safety. But she had discovered that even in danger, she could make a difference. Each day she practiced refining her melodies, learning new ones, imagining the streets and buildings filled with music, imagining people finding hope in her notes. One morning, as she walked to the street where the piano had been, she saw that it had been moved slightly, protected by a group of adults. They had cleared some debris, making space for her to play again. She felt a lump in her throat. The piano, like her, had survived the chaos, and someone had taken care to ensure it could continue to bring comfort to those who needed it. She sat down carefully, brushing dust from the keys, and played again. The sound was hesitant at first, then grew stronger. Carrying through the empty streets like a ribbon of hope, more people came this time. Soldiers, neighbors, children, elders, all drawn to the music. They stood in silence, listening, letting the melody reach places in their hearts that words could not touch. Some cried quietly, some held hands, some simply closed their eyes and let the notes remind them of life before the destruction. The girl realized that her music had become more than notes. It was a bridge between people. A small piece of humanity preserved in the middle of war. A young man from the crowd approached her after she had finished playing. He did not speak immediately, only nodded, his eyes reflecting gratitude and wonder. He offered a small notebook and pencil, suggesting she write down her melodies so they could be remembered. She nodded silently, understanding the importance of preserving these moments. Music, she realized, was fragile, but it could endure if shared and remembered. As the days passed, she continued to play on that street piano whenever it was safe. Each performance drew more listeners, and slowly news of the girl and her piano began to reach other parts of the city. People spoke of her bravery, her determination, and the small miracles her music created. Yet she remained humble, never thinking of herself as special. She only knew that music had a power beyond fear, beyond destruction, and that she could use it to give others a moment of peace, even in moments of danger. When explosions were closer, or the sounds of war more frightening, she would return to the piano. Each note was a defiance against fear, a statement that life and hope could continue, even in impossible circumstances. She learned to play with her heart as much as her hands, letting every melody tell the story of the city, the people, the unbroken spirit that still lived within them. At home, her family felt the impact too. Her parents saw the difference in her confidence, the joy she found in her music despite the danger outside. They supported her as best they could, providing safety and encouragement. Her mother would sometimes sit nearby, listening quietly, tears in her eyes as the music brought a moment of peace to a world that had been consumed by uncertainty. Her father, too, paused in his work to hear her play. Understanding that these melodies were more than just notes, they were lifelines. The girl realized that the piano had become her voice when words were not enough. In a city torn apart by fear, it allowed her to reach people in ways she had never imagined. It gave them courage, it gave them hope, and most importantly, it reminded them that even in darkness, there could be light. The music had survived, and so had she, and together they created a small sanctuary in the middle of chaos. Word of the girl and her piano spread quietly at first. Neighbors spoke to friends, friends told others, and soon small groups of people would gather whenever she played. Her music became a thread connecting people who had grown fearful and withdrawn, a tiny spark of normalcy in a city that had been swallowed by chaos. Yet she did not realize how far the sound of her piano would reach, or how it would touch lives she could never meet. One afternoon, a stranger came to the street where she had been playing. He carried a small camera and spoke softly to the adults gathered nearby, asking if he could film her performance. The girl paused, unsure at first. Cameras were unfamiliar, and she did not understand why anyone would want to record her music. But when she saw the hope in the eyes of those around her, the encouragement of the adults, she nodded and began to play. The notes floated through the street, strong and clear. Even carrying over the distant rumble of destruction, the recording captured more than just music. It captured courage, innocence, and the fragile humanity that persisted despite fear. People in the background watched in silence, faces softened by the melody, and children listened, eyes wide, momentarily forgetting the dangers surrounding them. The camera moved carefully, as if it knew it was documenting something sacred. The girl played for what felt like hours, but to the stranger holding the camera, every note mattered. Each key she pressed told a story, one that could be understood even by those far away. When the recording was shared on the radio, and later on small television broadcasts, it was unlike anything the world had seen. People watched in disbelief, unable to comprehend how such beauty could exist amidst destruction. News anchors spoke softly, showing clips of the girl playing in the ruined street, her small hands moving over the piano keys, and the crowd standing silently around her, touched by the music. Comments flooded in from viewers, sharing stories of tears, hope, and inspiration. In a world full of reports about violence and fear, this small moment became a reminder that humanity could endure. The girl had no idea that her music had reached so far. She continued to play as she always had, for the people in her street, for her own comfort, and for the small community that had formed around the piano. She noticed more faces joining each day soldiers, stopping for a brief moment. Neighbors emerging from their homes, children creeping closer. They listened without words, letting the music carry their thoughts and emotions. Even without understanding the chaos outside, she knew that the music was needed, that it mattered. Her family noticed the change in her as well. They saw that she had grown more confident, more purposeful. Her mother encouraged her gently, preparing small meals she could carry to the street if she played for long periods. Her father, who had spent months focused on safety and survival, began to take small breaks to listen to her. He understood, quietly, that her music was a kind of strength that went beyond fear, a force that could remind people why life was worth protecting. At school, the few children who still attended returned cautiously, eager to hear the girl play. They would gather in the hallways, pressed close together, whispering softly to each other. Sometimes the teachers encouraged them to join in, clapping gently, humming along, or simply listening. It was a brief escape from lessons interrupted by distant explosions or sirens. A moment when the city felt more like it had before, even if just for a few minutes. The girl played for them without thinking about the attention she was getting. The music was instinctive, flowing from her heart, responding to the emotions of everyone around her. One evening, she received unexpected visitors. A group of journalists and volunteers arrived, bringing small gifts and words of encouragement. They spoke quietly, explaining that her music had reached people far beyond the city, that the recordings were inspiring others who had lost hope. The girl listened shyly at first, not fully understanding the magnitude of what they were saying. Her mother smiled quietly, tears glistening in her eyes, and her father nodded slowly, pride and worry mingling in his expression. Even with this newfound attention, the girl remained humble. She did not seek recognition or praise. She only knew that music was her way of making sense of the world, her way of keeping a sense of humanity alive when so much around her seemed broken. She continued to play in the streets, careful to choose times when it was safe, and each note carried the same quiet power as before. People came to listen, sometimes from other parts of the city, sometimes from nearby neighborhoods. Her music had become a meeting point, a place where fear could pause and hope could grow. News of her courage traveled across borders. Stories appeared in newspapers and on television broadcasts in faraway countries. People were amazed that a child, alone with her piano, could create a moment so powerful that it captured the attention of the world. Letters and messages arrived from strangers offering help, sending words of encouragement, and sharing stories of how her music had made them feel. For the first time, the girl realized that what she was doing mattered beyond her immediate surroundings. Her music was no longer just a personal refuge, it was a voice for others, a symbol of hope that could not be silenced. Despite this attention, the girl's life remained difficult. The city was still dangerous. Explosions and gunfire could be heard at a distance. Food was scarce, and supplies were often hard to find. Families continued to leave, some seeking safety, others forced to move by the destruction. The girl and her family stayed, careful and cautious, but still connected to the street and the piano. The contrast between the chaos outside and the peace created by her music became even more striking. Every note she played was a defiance of fear, a reminder that life could still contain beauty. One day, an older man approached her as she played. He spoke softly, praising her courage and telling her that her music had been heard by people who had almost given up hope. He explained that the melodies had reached someone who was trying to help families like hers, and that others were inspired to act kindly in ways small and large. The girl did not fully grasp the words, but she understood the feeling behind them, the idea that her music could do more than soothe, that it could inspire action, care, and connection. The street where she played slowly became a gathering place. People came not only to listen, but to help each other, to share what little they had, to create small communities amid the ruins. Soldiers would pause in their patrols, standing respectfully while the girl played. Children would bring small gifts of flour, a piece of bread, a drawing leaving them quietly near the piano. Adults would offer water or blankets, even in a city torn apart by fear. The music had created a small space where kindness and humanity could flourish. Her family continued to support her. Understanding the role she had taken on without fully realizing it, her mother made sure she was safe and fed, while her father helped manage the crowd to prevent danger. Her brother, when he could leave his duties helping neighbors, would sit and listen quietly, never interrupting, only absorbing the music. The piano had become a central part of their lives, and through it, the family discovered a purpose amid the uncertainty. Letters and messages from strangers began to arrive. Some were written by children, inspired by the courage of someone their age. Others were from adults who had been moved to tears by the videos and news reports. Each message carried gratitude, admiration, and hope. The girl read them quietly, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a sense of connection she had never experienced before. Music had given her a way to speak without words, to reach beyond the barriers of distance, fear, and destruction.